Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf of Daily Cloud, and I'm really thrilled and honored today to be interviewing someone who's already made such a difference in American history. It's Mark Meckler. He's currently president and CEO at Convention of States, but he's done so much more. He's president of Citizens for Self-Governance, a nonprofit focused on taking political power from Washington, D.C. and state capitals and returning it to the people in his bio. In 2009, and this is when I first became aware of his work, he co-founded the Tea Party Patriots, and that became the largest Tea Party organization in the nation. It built up to over 3,600 chapters and millions of members nationally. And then in 2013, the foreshadowing of what we're talking about today started. He founded the Convention of States Project, and this is dedicated to calling an Article 5 Convention of States. We'll be talking about that, to propose amendments to take power away from the federal government and return it to the people. So far, 3.2 million people have joined the Convention of States. He's a regular commentator on Fox News, Fox Business, and many others. He thinks of himself as a grassroots activist, giving a conservative perspective from a grassroots orientation. And, we welcome Mark Meckler. Thank you so much for joining us today at Daily Cloud.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So let's start with the most urgent thing at hand, Convention of States. This is what your heart is committed to right now. This is what all of your efforts are going into. Tell us more about it, please.
Sure. Article 5 of the United States Constitution contains the methods whereby we can amend the Constitution. We have 27 amendments. All of them have come through the first section of Article 5, which says when 2/3 of Congress choose to propose an amendment, then it goes out for ratification by 38 states, 3/4 of the states. There's a second clause that says if the people acting through their states want to propose amendments, then they can gather in convention to debate and propose amendments. That takes 2/3 of states to call a convention. And then again, anything that comes out of that convention would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that's the process we're using right now. It's very much of a grassroots process. It takes grassroots folks proposing that their legislatures actually pass these applications or resolutions calling for a convention. There are about 5 million people involved now. I need to update LinkedIn there. And this resolution has to pass in 34 states, both houses, no governor's signatures required. So far, it's passed in 15 states, real close in probably 2 to 4 more right now. And we have to get to the requisite 34 states to get that done.
So that's going to be challenging, according to my math, because don't you kind of need Democrats or blue states to cross over, as you would say, for the good of the country, right? But not necessarily to vote down the party line, as the DNC would have them vote. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's absolutely challenging from a party line basis, but it's important that folks understand exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about what can be discussed at a convention. So there are 3 subject matter areas that we're proposing that are in all these resolutions. First is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Primarily, this would include something like a balanced budget amendment. That's been polled for the last 30, 35 years, and it's about 80 to 85% of Americans consistently support this, so well across party lines. Second is anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. Again, this polls 80 to 85% across party lines. And the third one, a little broader, which is anything that would put scope and jurisdiction limits on the federal government. In other words, do we think the federal government is doing more than they should do? And we have polling that shows recently in the last year that 72% of Americans believe the federal government is too big and does too much. I want to acknowledge that on a partisan basis, there are great differences about what is it that they do too much of? Where should we spend the money? What is the approach? But there's widespread agreement that they're doing too much and that power should return to the people in the states.
Right. So basically, your strategy of getting to that magic number does depend on building alliances across party lines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's not easy to do because, I would argue that today in the United States of America, the left tends to be more tribal than the right. And I don't not mean that in a pejorative sense in any way. There's a fundamental thing on the right that we think that we're just these hardcore individualists. makes it hard to work together, to be honest with you. And so building coalitions is more difficult on the right. There's less orthodoxy on the right where you have to believe a certain way. I think this is part of the reason folks like you have been able to find homes and friends, on the right, right? You don't have to follow the right wing orthodoxy. So it is much harder on the left, but we do have Democrat sponsors around the country. We've had that. I want to be clear. I don't want to overstate it. It's definitely a minority. It's hard to get people to cross that line. I think that changes when we get to, say, 30 states, 29 states. And the reason I think that changes is because the game will be afoot and people will understand we're on our way to convention. It's going to happen and they're going to want to participate.
Understood. So, really, I mean, I just want to note as a lifelong liberal that we're in such surreal times
Yeah.
because we on the left always thought the right was so good at organizing that you guys moved in kind of military lockstep and were all able to fall into kind of message discipline and we were chaotic hippies. But, we're in times where roles have shifted and flipped around. And I think
Yes.
so really what we're talking about is kind of an historic, it's got precedent in American history, as you and I have discussed, but it's kind of a historic battle between state power and federal power. And one might argue, and it'll be really interesting to watch this as a Democrat, to see when and how the Democrats kind of react to this as you gain momentum. It is arguably in the interest of Democrats at the state level to seize back some power from the federal government. Because you're not saying at the state level, more power has to go to Republican governors, Republican legislatures. You're saying it's a struggle between state legislatures and the federal government, and whatever, blue or red or purple, the people at the state level need to grab back some power. Is that a fair assessment? That it's actually arguably in the interest of even Democratic or Democrat-led or Democrat majority state legislatures to grab back some powers?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And really, that's the history of America. This country was founded on the idea of federalism and this amazing system of governance where a limited amount of powers were put in the hands of people who are far, far away from most of us, not connected to most of us. And the idea that a senator from New York would really hold any sway over what happened in Texas, or a senator from Texas would hold sway over what happened in California, that's not how the government was designed. It was designed so that states could be relatively autonomous. Now, they're restrained, of course, by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and this is critically important. And we have a long history of this. But outside of that, outside of the enumerated powers in the Bill of Rights, the states were pretty much supposed to be able to do what they want. During the Trump administration, I would talk to my friends on the left and I would say, do you like the idea of President Trump telling you what to do? Now, of course, I had to move so I didn't get punched out when I said that. Of course, they hated it, and that's reasonable. And they didn't like it when you had conservatives in charge of the House and the Senate. Or now they look at the Supreme Court and say it's a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and they don't like those things. And by the way, neither do I. I don't, as a conservative, I don't like those things. I don't want the president to be able to tell people in New York, generally speaking, what to do, or California, or Illinois, or New Jersey, or any state that leans left. And so what we have in this country now is a system where we essentially have 50% of the people who are mad all the time. If you're a Republican and Democrats are in charge, you're frustrated, you're mad, you feel like you're being cut out, your rights are being trampled on, and vice versa. The way that we fix that and learn to live together is take the power out of DC, give it back to the states, and let the states govern as they should. I come from California originally. It's a huge liberal majority in California, meaning that state should be governed from the left. And if I don't like that, then I can do what I did. I can pack up my family and I can move to Texas. But if the federal government decides everything and you live in California, you can't move to Texas. It's going to be all the same wherever you are. Same goes true if you live in Texas and you'd rather live in a more liberal state like California and New York. There's not going to be any place to go with the federal government centralizing power.
Gotcha. And we're seeing that. I mean, I don't want to get ahead of this subject, but the power grabs we're seeing now of the federal government saying what our kids have to wear on their faces or what it gets injected into their bodies, the empowering of health departments from the federal level through the state level, it really is kind of a federal power grab to subvert state checks and balances as I see it. What's your view of that?
I completely agree. This is actually, to me, the most scary thing that I've seen in my lifetime is to see the federal government and bureaucrats, unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, literally, they can't even be fired, a lot of them, because they're government employees subject to government union contracts. And they're telling you and I, whatever state we're in, what the way our children are going to go to school. And look, they don't actually have the authority to do that. So they condition money on that. So these school districts don't really have a choice, or the vaccinations are the same thing. We should be able to decide on a state by state, and frankly, in my opinion, even more on a local basis, what we want our children to wear on their face when they go to school.
Yeah. You've just solved a big mystery. I've been trying to figure out what is the leverage. Why are people falling in line with these federal mandates when furious, local parents are standing up at school board meetings saying, "Not my child, not my child." And you've just answered the question. I was also struck, we did a video on impeachment, and I was very struck to find out that officials can be impeached, right? And so one of the things you're calling for is for federal officials to face term limits. So you don't have, say, a Dr. Fauci becoming so powerful after decades and decades and decades that no science can take place in the United States without his okay. Am I fairly summarizing what one of the planks in your platform at the Convention of States will do in terms of getting rid of institutionalized corruption at a federal level with career bureaucrats? Is that right?
Absolutely. So you'll notice if you look at our resolution, people can see this at conventionofstates.com. It says term limits for federal officials. It doesn't say members of Congress, because we want all federal officials subject to this. In other words, bureaucrats like Fauci. But we all have a shelf life in whatever we do, right? And if you do it long enough, you become entrenched. You become literally your motives can be about preserving your own power and your own position. This is normal human nature.
Right.
It's not because he's an evil guy. And so I do think it's time for him to go. And I think it would be healthy if we had a reasonable turnover at the institutional level. Fauci maybe he should have been a 15-year bureaucrat. Maybe that should be the limitation. I don't know what the right date is.
Right. Right, but it does absolutely return power to the people if they're not happy with entrenched leadership, career civil servants. Those people are answerable to the people, as arguably they should be, right? Again, I was so surprised that impeachment was a low bar, and that the founders set up a system to clear it out, not for like gigantic historic crimes, but just for the people deciding, you're not representing me well, this is not transparent, you're not accountable, out you go. I was very surprised. So this brings us to the next question. A lot of people listening to you will think that what you're saying is incredibly radical and possibly dangerously novel. And you and I had this conversation. You did a super nerdy, which I appreciated, kind of tour of American history, in which you showed me that at certain key points, our originally non-top heavy federal system became granted greater and greater powers. And that was very eye-opening to me. So I'm going to ask you to recapitulate that, but I'm also going to ask you to answer the question then after you recapitulate that. Is what you're saying super radical, super new, or are you calling on established history and going back to essentially established principles that the founders set up? Over to you for that.
Okay, so if we look through sort of a quick march through American history, and I'm writing a book on this right now called The Great Decoupling. The country, I think most of us would agree today, whatever side of the aisle we're on, the country's coming apart. We are decoupling. You've got liberals, you've got conservatives or libertarians on the other side. And the country is splitting. It's splitting commercially, it's splitting culturally. We're listening to different music, watching different television, supporting different politicians. And we think this is new and unique and amazing and terrible. And I don't think it is. I think it's our history. If you go all the way back to the founding, what you find is prior to the American Revolution, the colonies didn't much like each other. It was mostly along lines of Christian sectarianism. Different sects thought the other sects were blasphemers and sinners. And so they moved off into different colonies and formed different colonies. And then you have the war for independence. And in that war, there was an existential threat from a foreign king, essentially. The monarch was limiting our rights. So we joined arms and we fought this war. You would think that after that war, we would really like each other and trust each other. Nothing could be further from the truth, because what happened is you get the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were the first government of the United States, the first constitution, so to speak. And it basically gave zero power to the federal government because we disliked and distrusted each other so much. It didn't work because there was no power at the central government. The central government couldn't do anything it needed to do. So we gathered again in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. And again, we have this sort of fantasy. They all sat down, they drank tea together, they liked each other. That couldn't be further from the truth. They didn't like each other. They were accusatory. They were slanderous towards each other. And yet, out of all of that came the greatest system of governance ever invented for people who don't really like each other or get along, and that's federalism. And it worked for a long time. But what happened throughout history is there was a change of perception, and that perception went from we're all very different, we don't really like each other, but we got to get along in this limited government, to we're all the same. And there are cultural factors that took place. I would argue after World War II, we were fairly united as a country. And then we start to get national television shows. We're watching the same culture. We start to get national brands at Braxo soap and Lucky Strike cigarettes. We start to get national franchises, right? So you can travel from Mississippi to New York, stay in the same hotels, eat the same food. By the time you get to the 1970s, national sports leagues have proliferated. They're on TV all the time. We're all the same. And so this is the heyday of big government, because why not? And if Mississippians are the same as New Yorkers, then why not live under the same central government? You've got economy of scale, right? And we can trust in all of the experts. But underneath, we're the same as we've ever been. I mean, you travel a lot. I travel a lot. I go to Mississippi. I'm going to be honest with you. Folks in Mississippi, if you say, what do you think of people in New York? They're like, well, those people are rude and snobby, and, they don't really like them. They're pushy. And if you talk to people in New York about people in Mississippi, they say, oh, aren't those the people who marry their cousins? Or, I mean, I'm being facetious, but we hear those things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we still don't really like each other. So the question is, can we coexist, and should we coexist? And I think the argument that I would make is the world is still an existentially dangerous place. We've just seen it in Afghanistan. If you have drug cartels on our border, we can't face off against this stuff alone. I'm a Texan, and Texans are like, yeah, we'll go our own way. We'll be it's not going to work. You can't face off against China. So we need each other existentially. And so the way to do it is to do something that's not radical, something that has a historical basis, which is go back to federalism. The founders gave us this formula. It worked for a long period of our history. We really started decaying about 100, 115 years ago. We need to go back to that. In other words, what I'm saying is we need to separate governmentally so we can continue to live together in a country.
What do you mean? Wow. What do you mean by separate governmentally? And, I think your description of how, with brands and corporate unity and kind of post World War II unity, we became one country. I think respectfully that elides other giant divisions and unifications like slavery,
Yeah.
anti-slavery. But having said that, why why should we divide? And you seem to be, it's a little bit of a contradiction, right? I mean,
Yeah,
how are the,
absolutely it is.
how do
Well,
we,
and I want to go back to slavery for a moment, because I did bypass it. It's a super important part of American history, and it's important for a number of reasons. I mean, one, it's important to remember that we fought a war to end slavery. Over 500,000 killed. If you consider killed and injured, 700,000. We were the first country in history to pass a law outlawing the slave trade. And so there's this incredible history, this very dark history, but also us leading the Western world out of slavery. Slavery still exists in 90 countries around the world today legally. There are more people enslaved today in the world than ever before in American history. Most people, because we don't have it here and we haven't for a long time, most people forget about that. But the period of the Civil War is super important in this narrative that I painted. It's just a lot longer. The issue with the Civil War, when you think about it, is we actually fought a war, and we actually forced half of the country to stay in a country they didn't want to belong in. And this is a pretty radical concept. I think it's incredible that we did it. This is a really incredibly difficult moral question, what we did here. We did the right thing, no doubt, in my opinion, and history has shown that. And it's the right moral thing, according to what I believe. But you think about that, we forced a unity on the country. We pretend that we were unified. We weren't unified after the war. That was forced unity. And so I think we've always been divided as a country. We're not divided in that way any longer, but we're divided in other ways. And we've always been divided. So when I say we should come apart so we can stay together, we should go back to something closer to what we were upon our original union, which is we all agreed we need to be together. We need each other for certain purposes, for foreign trade, for foreign relations, for border security. There are things that we can only do together. If you're going to build an interstate highway system, you got to do that all together. And so we can be unified for enough things to be a strong nation and yet still have our individual cultures and systems of governance within the states.
Yeah, wow. I mean, this vision raises so many questions. I guess, so let me share that I went to New Hampshire to Freedom Fest, or I'm sorry, some other libertarian festival, and Pork Fest. And they want to secede, and other, there are other secession movements going on. Eastern Oregon wants to secede. Northern California doesn't like Southern California. And my husband, who's a veteran, said that's, really attractive, but how will they fight a war, right? If they, all these cute militias with their, weapons cannot fight a war if we're attacked by a superpower or even by, Canada. They can't fight a war.
Right.
So part of me is listening to this and thinking, yeah, it sounds really attractive. Federal government has overreached. Obviously, we need to empower the states. And I've been going to state legislatures for the Five Freedoms campaign that you and I discussed. And I'm so impressed at the kind of sincerity
Yes.
and decency of so many state legislators. I'm sure there's corruption everywhere, but compared to the national level, it is a shining beacon of,
Yes.
accountable leadership. And I want those people, to have their powers back. They are closer to their friends and neighbors. They do represent better. They can be swept out more easily when they do something wrong. But the danger is, say we follow this siren call, we weaken ourselves arguably, or, by your logic, the Jim Crow states could still be Jim Crow states, the no abortion states could still be no abortion states. Maybe you think that's okay. I could see arguments in support of not imposing federally a view about abortion that people locally don't hold. But really horrible things, we could resegregate the schools, right? I mean, we're seeing segregation, medical-based segregation in blue states now. They could go crazy with continuing to segregate without any intervention from the federal government if we ever get decent people in power again who don't like this kind of segregation and see that it's illegal. So while I hear how compelling this vision is in so many ways, isn't the danger that we will become weaker? And then what I have to look at is Britain. Britain did what you're describing. They decoupled from the EU. The EU isn't in great condition right now, and I saw even at that time the advantage of Britain being its own nation again, right? You can't have a democracy without borders. You can't have a democracy, without representational government accountable to the people. However, they're also completely at the mercy of their leadership now with medical imperialism, and they don't have human rights law that protects them at a EU level, and they're being isolated and they're being lied to, and arguably they're more vulnerable. They don't have mass protests in Britain the way they do in Italy and France because they can't even see what's going on in Italy and France. So the danger is we listen to you and then we become scattered and divided and at the mercy of our enemies. What would you say to that devil's advocate question?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to deal with the idea of the reimposition of Jim Crow laws. It's a good example of what cannot happen. And this is why, because the government of every state would still be bound through the extension of the 14th Amendment by the Bill of Rights. And so there's nothing in our application that would allow the repeal of or the alteration of anything in the Bill of Rights. And so you would retain all the rights and privileges that are, in my opinion, God-given rights and privileges that are protected by the United States Constitution. What it would allow there to be is different education systems, different healthcare systems, different environmental regulation systems, different agricultural regulation systems, things that were always intended to be left to the local people. I mean, the idea to me, for example, that the EPA tells people in California how to regulate their environment. California has the California, I think it's the CEPA, California EPA, or CEQA, actually, CEQA. And they do a great job regulating their own environment. They
Yeah.
don't need the federal government to tell them how to regulate their environment. And people would say, here's a counter argument. I'm going to make the argument against what I'm saying here. People would say, well, Texas is such a right-wing state. Maybe states near Texas are going to be polluted by things that Texas does if we don't have an EPA. And the answer to that is actually, this is part of the reason we have a federal court system,
Right.
because one state can sue another state for negatively affecting its environment. It's been done thousands of times, literally, pollution flowing through rivers or through the air across state lines. We don't need these government agencies at the federal level telling us all what to do at the state level. You maintain the fundamental protections that you and I know are so basic and so important to our existence and our exceptionalism as a nation through the Bill of Rights. Those still remain applicable to everybody in the states.
Well, that is reassuring. I mean, both those points are reassuring. And I would just note to Democrats watching that actually federal power cuts both ways, as you rightly pointed out, because during the Trump administration, the federal government was trying to not let California be as good on the environment or as
Right.
rigorous on the environment as they wanted to be. So that your argument is well taken. And then would you say that
Let me add one more piece. This is really important. Most people don't realize this. Missouri attempted to outlaw slavery long before the Civil War, and they were prevented from doing so by the federal government. And so this is an extraordinary thing. It's a dark, dark thing in American history that most people don't realize. This is important. You said it cuts both ways. Oftentimes the federal government is not our friend, and we tend from one side or the other to look at them as friend or foe, but it cuts both ways.
No, absolutely. And you're really illuminating a blind spot on the left because our mythology is that big government is always good. It's always the WPA, right? It's always artist murals and, Tennessee Valley Authority and desegregation. And it's never internment camps, which
Right.
I believe, were federal and not state by state.
Yeah, and for me, it's important to go back to the best example of this in all of American history, in my opinion, is the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson is probably, well, he's certainly the most high-ranking, hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool racist. I'd call him hood wearing, except for I never saw him in a hood, but he was actually a supporter and promoter of the Klan. He's a Democrat in the White House. He erased Black people from American history as America's most prominent historian. He resegregated the federal workforce. It had been desegregated just naturally over time. I'm not saying civil rights were where they should be, but it was way better than it was after he was in office. He
Wow.
intentionally resegregated all of the departments of the federal government. So this is the federal government acting in a way that's really bad and really dangerous. It cuts both ways. It's never just one way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what would you say about the military problem that empowering the states, defederalizing to some extent, creates? How do we stay strong militarily? How do we not become vulnerable? How will we protect ourselves if there's a global threat and we need a military?
So I actually think this helps us because one of the enumerated powers is the defense of the United States. And so this puts the federal government, back in the position of focusing on the things that it should focus on, not focusing on everything. Nobody can do everything well. No entity, no level of government can do everything well. So if you limit the powers of the federal government, and one of the main powers is to raise a standing army and to protect our borders. And so if you get them focused on only the things that they were supposed to do under the enumerated powers, I think they'll do a better job of doing those things, not a lesser job.
Got it. So, under your vision or the vision of the Convention of States, I'm assuming National Guards become kind of more important at the state level, but a federal army still protects us on a global scale. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, Naomi, I've never really thought about the National Guard question. I just think it allows our federal government to focus on our national defense. I'd have to think more, different states have different ways that they interact with their National Guard. I'd have to think about that. I think they would retain that autonomy to behave as they choose with their National Guard troops.
Oh, well, just to share where I'm coming from, in the end of America, I noticed that the National Guard answer to the people effectively because they are commanded by the governor. The
Right.
governor is answerable to the people, whereas the military is so scary, right? If they're deployed domestically because they
Right.
don't answer to the local population. And the same thing with police forces. I mean, it was so scary. Like everything you're saying is kind of giving me chills because watching assaults on democracy over the last 12 years, as I have here in the United States, so much of it is about federalization. And what I'm
Yes.
thinking of right now is during the time when you were active with the Tea Party, and I was writing The End of America and talking about how the terrorism threat was being used, as real as it was, to strip us of our rights and liberties. It was the federalizing of local police forces and the
Yes.
sending federal armored tanks and tasers and things that local police forces with their relationships to the community would never have needed before. And this was not good for local people's rights and liberties on the ground. It wasn't even good for police forces. So there are many examples in our recent history of federalization not empowering the people, but
Absolutely.
contrary. So, well, you've been super generous with your time. Is there anything else you want to say about tyranny? That's something I wanted to be sure to give you, every opportunity to say what you want to say. Is your organization especially important now because of the bio-fascist coup, as I call it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I'm glad you brought us back to sort of the Patriot Act and all the loss of rights that we've seen literally, I would say, over the last 20 years. And one of the things that this is just human nature, when people are afraid, people give up their rights for security, or at least for the auspices of security. And we saw this post 9/11 with the Patriot Act, which was an incredible unconstitutional overreach of historic proportions, which still exists today, unfortunately. And there were reasons for reform. They went way too far, and the American people allowed it to happen. And I think we continue to let that happen because we don't feel day-to-day effects of the Patriot Act. I mean, I can promise you, you know this better than I do. They're collecting our data. They're going to have this recording. It's going to be in the archives at the NSA and their big data center in Utah. When we make a phone call, those phone calls are all recorded. They're going in the NSA archives. But if you're an average person, you never feel that. You never think about it, so you're not concerned about it. It's an infringement, a major infringement on your right to privacy, your freedom of speech, but we don't worry about it. And so now what we're seeing with all the biomedical fascism taking place in America today is actually a direct impact on us. We actually feel it. When they say you have to wear something on your face every day, when they tell you where you can go, when they tell you your business, your personal business is not essential and they're going to shut you down, when they tell you you have to roll up the sleeve and take a jab in your arm, or you have to do that to get papers so that you can go to the theater. I was just in downtown Austin. I was walking by the Paloma Theater. It was such a juxtaposition. There was some country western concert going on. I don't know exactly what it was. So you had all these folks in cowboy hats and boots and skirts, and they're walking up with their masks on and pulling out their ID cards, their vaccination cards. And I looked at that and I thought, this is like some weird science fiction simulation of America. That here in Texas, that we Texans who don't tolerate this kind of stuff lightly, we're so comfortable doing that. And so I'm really concerned about the rise of fascism in America and around the world. You see what's going on in Australia with the use of facial recognition and geo-targeting, so making sure folks aren't leaving their homes. There is an uprising going on, thank God, in Europe. You mentioned some of the stuff going on in Europe right now, hundreds of thousands of people coming out in the streets protesting vaccine passports. We live in very unusual times. I'm 59 years old. I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime. I don't think it's hyperbole to say fascism at a government level has arrived in the United States of America.
So I completely agree with everything you just said. And so, people watching who are persuaded by your vision, how can they help you? Where can they find you? What's next?
Well, first, I would say continue to follow you and introduce people to you because this kind of dialogue is super important. We got to listen to people that we don't think that we agree with because that's where we learn. So I think this kind of dialogue is really important. So I would say spread around Daily Clout and Naomi's work extensively. Number two is go to conventionofstates.com and you can go there. You can have your questions answered. We make all the counter arguments so that you can see the counter arguments as well. We're not scared of the debate. So go to conventionofstates.com. click on the button to sign the petition that goes to your state legislators. I know you guys are big on this kind of direct contact with state legislatures. I think that's really important as well. You're doing great work in that arena. And so do that. And then if you're really serious, which I think you should be because it's your country and we're losing it, then become a volunteer. Click on the resources tab, take action, and sign up to be a volunteer. And I guarantee you, you're going to find a family of like-minded people, and we're going to get you in the fight.
Fantastic. And is there a date for the convention, or is that to be determined?
To be determined. Like my optimistic is I think we get there in 2024. And really, I'll do it as long as it takes. This has become my life's work.
It's a make or break moment. Mark Meckler, Convention of States, thank you so much. And everyone, go check it out. See if you support it. If you do become a volunteer, get off the couch, as they say, put your heart and soul in saving this country. Thank you so much, Mark Meckler.
Thank you.